From Egyptians eating honey on sticks to today's modern-day confections, the subject of this episode is kicking off a series that will hopefully lead us into Halloween with a sweet twist. Just to warn you, there are some earworms in this episode, so take my advice, and if you happen to get a song stuck in your head, as I have since recording it, sing a Queen song. That always helps me. I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind Lollipops. But first, a quick message. Lollipop, lollipop, ooh, lolly, 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 lollipop. Ba-dum-bum-bum. I've talked before about my side project called Podcast Share, and I hope you're following along on Twitter at Podcast Share. If you're not, Podcast Share is a Twitter account that is taken over every week by a different curator to kind of live tweet what podcasts they're listening to. The curators are made up of other podcast hosts and listeners, and it's a really fun project, and I hope you'll join me in checking it out by following Podcast Share on Twitter or going to the website podcastshare.net to find out more. Maybe you think putting candy on a stick was a newer innovation, but the idea for it came about thousands of years ago when ancient Chinese, Arabs, and Egyptians would stick fruits and nuts in honey and attach those to pieces of wood for easier eating. The honey acted like a preservative, but as time went on, honey, and later sugar, was harder to come by. It wasn't until the 17th century in England when sugar became more accessible, and street vendors in London began selling meat on a stick, or soft candy on a stick. It was back then that the term lollipop started to gain traction. Lolly, by the way, meant tongue in northern England, and pop meant a slap, so lollipop literally translates to tongue slap. During the Civil War era, candy was put on top of pencils. Remember, this was before combining the pencil and the eraser, which is common today. But this is where the story starts taking a few different turns, since tons of candy makers have wanted to take credit for inventing one of the most popular treats. One origin story comes out of New Haven, Connecticut, where George Smith, co-owner of Bradley Smith Candy Company, came up with the idea of putting candy on a stick. Well, he may not have come up with it, as he was more inspired by a nearby chocolate caramel candy company that put its treats on sticks. And he went to his partner, Andrew Bradley, with the idea and named it after his favorite racehorse named Lollipop. There's a story along a similar vein that the Mickavini Candy Company, again out of New Haven, Connecticut, would use sticks to stir their boiled hard candy. And at the end of the day, either the owner or employees would bring these sticks home to their children, with the candy hardened to them. And in 1908, these became marketed as used candy sticks. Regardless of which story you believe, George Smith did take a patent out on lollipops in 1931, and even the word lollipop. That's lolly with a Y. But the patent was difficult to maintain since companies had been using the term frequently, and the spelling varied between using a Y or using an I. Another hassle with getting the patent was the fact that lollipop with an I wasn't an original word. The Oxford English Dictionary places the first usage in print in January of 1784 in the London Chronicle newspaper. Charles Dickens, known for using common London street slang, also used the term lollipop with a Y in his novels in the 19th century. However, the meaning wasn't referring to candy on a stick, but something sweet or meat on a stick that was popped into one's mouth, again referring to the tongue as a lolly. By the way, another company out of Racine, Wisconsin created what was known as the first automated machine that could put hard candy on a stick in 1908. However, they didn't refer to this as a lollipop. Another story comes out of San Francisco in 1912, when a Russian immigrant named Samuel Bourne invented a machine that could also stick hard candy on a stick, and it was aptly called the Bourne Sucker Machine. Samuel Bourne is also credited with creating chocolate sprinkles. Unfortunately, when the Great Depression hit, lollipops weren't in high demand, and candy companies like Bradley Smith were forced to close down, negating the patent even further. But when a child star named Shirley Temple graced the screen in 1934 and sang what would become one of her signature songs, sales began to rise.
On the good ship, Lollipop, it's a sweet trip to a candy shop where bonbons play.
Lollipops continued to grow in their popularity, making their way into more pop culture, like the Lollipop Guild in 1939's The Wizard of Oz. And in 1958, the female singing group the Chordettes popularly covered the song Lollipop, which beat out the original version by Ronald and Ruby on the charts to reach number 2.
Lollipop, lollipop, oh lolly, 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 lollipop, lollipop, oh lolly, 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 lollipop, lollipop, oh lolly, lolly, lollipop.
When Spaniard Enrique Bernet came up with the idea of a bonbon on a stick in the late 50s, he originally named it Goal, as in a soccer ball going into the mouth of a net. But the product was renamed Chupa Chups, chupa being Spanish for to suck. But he had some trouble with the branding, which he discussed over coffee with one of his friends, none other than Salvador Dali. And it was Dali who sketched what would become the Lollipops logo. Dali even suggested it be placed on top so everyone would see the name. The logo has since been slightly altered, but it's still pretty similar to Dali's original 1969 design. If any of you remember the show Kojak, at the end of solving a crime, he would notably unwrap a Tootsie Pop and stick it in his mouth. And speaking of Tootsie Pops, if you've ever heard the rumor that finding a Tootsie Pop wrapper with an Indian and shooting stars on it can be mailed to the Tootsie Roll Company for a prize, I'm sorry to disappoint you by saying that that is a falsehood, which the company has had to deal with since 1931. But according to their website, if you do count the number of licks it takes to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop, without biting it that is, you can let them know on their Facebook page and receive a clean stick award from the famed Mr. Owl of the classic commercials.
Mr. Owl, how many licks does it take to get to the Tootsie Roll center of a Tootsie Pop?
Let's find out. 1, 2, 3, 3.
Information for this episode was sourced from candyfavorites.com, connecticuthistory.org, snopes.com, Mental Floss, and more links which can be found in the show notes at thestorybehindpodcast.com. This episode was brought to you by the Story Behind executive producers who support the show through the Patreon page at patreon.com/thestorybehind. Thanks for listening.